A leadership team walks into a Monday morning meeting mildly optimistic about a risky market expansion. Nobody in the room is fully sold yet. A few people privately have real reservations they haven't voiced. 90 minutes later, that same team walks out, fully committed to the boldest version of the plan on the table. Timeline compressed, budget expanded, contingency planning quietly dropped because, as one person put it on the way out, "We're confident this is going to work." Nobody presented new data in that room. Nobody ran new numbers, brought in outside evidence, or changed anyone's actual information about the market. The group simply talked itself further in the direction it was already leaning before anyone said a word out loud. This has a name, and it isn't the one most people reach for. Most people would call this groupthink, but groupthink and this phenomenon are actually different animals wearing similar clothes. Groupthink, as psychologist Irving Janis described it in 1972, is about a group suppressing dissent to preserve harmony, people biting their tongues because disagreement feels socially costly, everyone silently agreeing not to rock the boat. What happened in that Monday meeting is something else. It's called group polarization, sometimes referred to as group shift, and the unsettling part is that it doesn't require anyone to suppress anything. It doesn't need silence, conformity, pressure, or a domineering leader in the room. It just needs open, energetic, good-faith discussion among people who already lean the same direction, and the group ends up more extreme than any individual walked in with. The earliest hint of this pattern showed up almost by accident. In 1961, a graduate student named James Stoner ran an experiment for his master's thesis at MIT, expecting to confirm the opposite of what he found. The conventional wisdom at the time held that groups make more cautious decisions than individuals, the old idea that a camel is a horse designed by committee, watered down, and risk-averse by nature. Stoner gave people a set of hypothetical dilemmas, choices between a safe, modest option and a riskier option with a bigger payoff, and asked them to decide individually first, then discuss the same dilemmas as a group, and decide again. Groups, he found, consistently landed on riskier decisions than the average of their individual members' choices before discussion. Researchers called it the risky shift, and it puzzled people for most of a decade because it directly contradicted the assumption that committees water things down. Then, in 1969, French social psychologists Serge Moscovici and Marisa Zavalloni ran a version of the same kind of study, but they didn't stack the deck with only risk-favoring dilemmas. They gave people topics where individuals already leaned mildly one direction before any discussion, sometimes toward caution, sometimes toward risk. What they found reframed the entire risky shift literature. Groups didn't reliably shift toward risk. They shifted toward whatever direction they already leaned, just more so. A group that leaned mildly cautious before talking became distinctly more cautious after talking. A group that leaned mildly bold became distinctly bolder. Moscovici and Zavalloni coined the term group polarization to describe this, and it explained the earlier risky shift findings neatly, since most of Stoner's original dilemmas happened to be ones where people already leaned toward risk before discussion even started. The pattern held up outside the lab too, and this is where it starts to matter for anyone who runs meetings for a living. Researchers studying juries found that if most jurors privately lean toward a harsher verdict or a larger damages award before deliberation begins, the jury, as a group, typically lands on something harsher after deliberating, not something more moderate. Legal scholar Cass Sunstein and psychologist David Schkard ran mock jury studies specifically on punitive damages awards, and found juries that leaned toward a high award before deliberating tended to award even more after talking it through together, while juries that leaned low tended to award even less. Deliberation, the exact process courts assume produces careful, balanced judgment, was instead amplifying whatever direction the room already leaned before anyone spoke. So why does this happen? Researchers point to two separate mechanisms working together, and both are worth understanding because they show up in completely different ways inside a business meeting. The first is social comparison theory. People want to be seen favorably by the group, and in most groups, being seen favorably means appearing at least as committed to the group's shared direction as everyone else, not less. If a team already leans toward boldness, nobody wants to be the person who looks like the weak link, the one dragging the group's confidence down. So as people take turns speaking, each person doesn't just state their real position. They slightly overstate it, nudging their stated view a bit further than their private view to make sure they're read as being at least as committed as their peers. Multiply that small individual overstatement across everyone in the room, and the group's stated center of gravity drifts further than any individual in it actually believes, purely from people managing how committed they appear to look. The second mechanism is called persuasive arguments theory, and it's less about social image and more about raw information flow. In a room where most people already lean the same direction, most of the arguments anyone hears in that meeting are going to support that direction too, simply because that's what the majority believes and is prepared to say out loud. Someone walks in mildly in favor of the expansion. During the meeting, they hear 4 colleagues each offer a slightly different reason the expansion makes sense, reasons they hadn't personally considered before. Even if nobody presents a single new fact, hearing 4 novel arguments in favor, arguments they hadn't weighed themselves, genuinely shifts their private view further in that direction. It isn't peer pressure. It's real persuasion, just persuasion drawn entirely from a biased sample of arguments, because the room was never a representative sample of all possible views on the decision in the first place. There's a third layer to this worth knowing, because it explains why some teams polarize hard and others barely move at all. Legal scholar Cass Sunstein spent years studying what he eventually called the law of group polarization, and one of his clearest findings is that the effect scales directly with how homogeneous the group already is. A room full of people from wildly different functions, backgrounds, and starting opinions polarizes much less. Because persuasive arguments theory runs out of fuel fast, someone in the room is likely to hold a genuinely different starting view and voice a genuinely different argument. A room full of people who already think alike, same function, same tenure, same incentive structure, same read on the market, polarizes hard and fast because there's no friction anywhere in the conversation to slow the drift. This is the uncomfortable overlap with how most leadership teams and specialist departments actually get built. Hiring for culture fit and promoting people who've absorbed the same institutional read on the world doesn't just create a pleasant, harmonious room. It quietly manufactures the exact conditions group polarization needs to run unchecked. A chamber where everyone's starting lean points the same direction, and nobody in the room is positioned to introduce real friction. Picture a leadership team evaluating whether to enter a new market. Going into the meeting, most people are cautiously positive, maybe a 6 out of 10 on conviction, aware of real risks, but leaning toward yes. Over the course of the discussion, each executive who speaks in favor adds a reason nobody else had raised: competitive pressure, an underserved customer segment, a founder's gut instinct that this is the direction the industry is heading. Nobody wants to be the one voice actively questioning the room's growing enthusiasm, especially once 3 or 4 people have already spoken with real conviction. By the end, the team isn't voting on a cautious 6 out of 10 anymore. They're planning an aggressive, accelerated rollout, skipping the pilot phase they would have insisted on individually, because the room collectively talked itself past where any single person started. The same dynamic shows up in performance calibration meetings, the sessions where managers sit together and rank or rate employees across a team or department. If the room walks in with a mild lean that a particular team has been underperforming, that lean rarely stays mild through the meeting. Each manager who speaks adds a specific example that reinforces the shared read. A missed deadline here, a disappointing client call there, and the room's collective judgment hardens faster than any single manager's private assessment would have on its own. Ratings that started as mildly critical end up harshly critical by the end of the session, not because new evidence changed anyone's mind, but because everyone in the room heard several confirming stories in a row, and nobody wanted to be the person defending a team the whole room had visibly started to agree was struggling. Hiring committees run into it constantly. A panel debriefs after interviewing a candidate, and if the first 2 people to speak are lukewarm, the group conversation tends to drift toward rejection even faster than either of those 2 people privately felt, because each subsequent speaker adds one more reason the candidate wasn't quite right. And nobody wants to be the lone voice pushing back once the room's mood has visibly settled. The reverse happens just as often with a candidate the room likes early. A mildly positive first impression turns into an offer with an inflated title and comp package by the end of the debrief. Because 4 people in a row each added their own favorable anecdote, and the accumulated momentum of the conversation outran what any individual actually believed walking in. It shows up in go or no-go decisions too. The meetings where a team decides whether a product ships on schedule or a launch gets delayed. If the room walks in mildly confident the timeline will hold, that confidence tends to calcify into certainty by the end of the meeting, with legitimate warning signs getting reframed as manageable in real time as the discussion builds its own momentum. Someone raises a real concern about a testing gap, and instead of that concern anchoring the group, it gets absorbed and reframed within minutes, because the room's collective energy is already moving in the confident direction, and one dissenting data point isn't enough to reverse it, once several people have already voiced conviction out loud. Launches get green-lit that, individually, half the room would have privately flagged as premature. Board meetings and investment committees show a sharper version of the same pattern, precisely because the stakes make the social pressure more acute rather than less. A board that walks into a quarterly meeting mildly worried about a competitor's new product often walks out having approved emergency spending that no single board member would have proposed on their own, because each concerned comment builds on the last one, and by the 3rd or 4th speaker, sounding calm about the threat starts to feel like not taking it seriously enough. Investment committees show the mirror image just as often, walking in cautiously excited about a deal and walking out having waived diligence steps that existed specifically to catch problems like the one nobody wanted to be, the party who raised in a room that had already decided to be. Enthusiastic. In both cases, the room's final position isn't a weighted average of everyone's judgment. It's an amplified version of wherever the room already leaned, reached through a process that felt, to everyone inside it, like careful deliberation. This also compounds across a series of meetings on the same topic, not just within a single session. A team that meets weekly to track an initiative doesn't reset its collective lean between sessions. It starts each new meeting from wherever the group ended up the previous week, then drifts further along the same 2 mechanisms from that new, already shifted starting point. Over a quarter of weekly check-ins, a team can walk itself an enormous distance from where any individual member started, one incremental nudge at a time, with each individual meeting looking perfectly reasonable in isolation. Nobody would defend the ending position if it were presented cold on day 1. But nobody experienced it that way, because it arrived gradually, 3 or 4 small increments at a time, each one feeling like the natural, well-reasoned continuation of the last. Here's the mistake most managers make, and it's an easy one to make because it feels like exactly the opposite of a mistake. Managers read a room that leaves a meeting more energized, more unified, and more confident than it walked in, and they interpret that as evidence the meeting worked. Energy and unity get treated as proxies for quality. A team that argues its way into stronger conviction looks, from the front of the room, like a team that just did good, rigorous thinking together. But conviction and correctness are not the same axis, and a room that walks out feeling more certain hasn't necessarily reasoned its way to a better answer. It's often just done what groups reliably do when everyone already leans the same way before they start talking, which is amplify that lean and dress the amplification up as clarity. The fix isn't fewer meetings, and it isn't telling people to argue less passionately. Passionate, energetic debate is exactly the mechanism that produces the polarization in the first place. So muting the energy doesn't solve the underlying problem, it just makes meetings duller while the same dynamic still operates underneath. The actual fix is structural, and it targets the 2 mechanisms directly instead of trying to will them away with good intentions. Start by capturing where people actually stand before the discussion begins, privately and individually, on paper or in a quick anonymous poll, before anyone speaks out loud. This single step blunts social comparison theory almost entirely, because once someone's honest private position is already recorded, there's far less pressure to perform extra conviction just to keep pace with the room. It also gives the manager a baseline to compare against at the end. If the group's final decision looks dramatically more extreme than the average of those private starting positions, that gap itself is useful information, a signal the room polarized rather than reasoned its way there. Second, assign someone specifically to argue the opposing case, not as a vague call for objections, but as an actual named role for that meeting, ideally rotated so it isn't always the same person absorbing the social cost of disagreement. This directly targets persuasive arguments theory, because it guarantees the room hears a meaningful sample of arguments on both sides, instead of a lopsided stream of arguments that all point the same direction. It matters that this is assigned rather than volunteered. Waiting for a volunteer to disagree recreates the exact conditions, diffusion of responsibility, reluctance to be the outlier, that let polarization run unchecked in the first place. Third, require the room to state disagreement out loud before consensus is allowed to form, rather than treating silence as agreement. Ask directly, not with an open any objections that lets responsibility diffuse across the whole room, but with individual questions aimed at specific people. What's the strongest reason this could go wrong? Who here privately rates this lower than the room's current mood suggests? These specific prompts make it socially acceptable, even expected, to voice a lower private number without it reading as obstruction, which is usually the exact thing people are quietly afraid of once a room has already built momentum. Fourth, build in a deliberate cooling-off period for any decision above a certain size, a rule that the room cannot finalize a major call in the same session where the enthusiasm peaked. Write the decision down at the end of the meeting exactly as the room stated it, then revisit it briefly at the start of the next meeting, after everyone has had a night or a weekend away from the room's collective energy. This alone catches a surprising number of decisions that looked obviously right inside the room, and considerably less obviously right 48 hours later. Once the social pressure that inflated everyone's stated conviction has had time to fade, and each person is back to weighing the decision against their own private judgment instead of the room's. None of this means group discussion is dangerous, or that decisions should get made in isolation. Groups genuinely do better than individuals at plenty of tasks, catching errors, pooling information, stress-testing assumptions nobody thought to raise alone. The danger isn't discussion itself. It's mistaking the feeling of growing conviction inside a room for evidence that the decision improved, when what actually happened is a predictable social mechanism amplifying wherever the room already leaned before anyone opened their mouth. If your team consistently walks out of every meeting more extreme, more certain, and more aggressive than it walked in, that pattern itself is worth noticing, because a room that always ends up more sure of itself than it started isn't refining its judgment meeting after meeting. It's just getting louder at agreeing with itself. If this is the kind of quiet pattern that's been steering decisions in your own meetings without anyone naming it, stick around. There's a new one of these broken down every week.